The silence of the High Sierra has always carried a strange kind of weight. It settles across the granite, moves through the thin pines, and lingers over the trails where thousands of hikers pass each year. But in Yosemite National Park, there is one story where that silence feels heavier than usual. On a calm afternoon in July 1981, 14-year-old Stacy Arras walked a short distance from a crowded camp, just far enough to take a picture, and never returned. The search that followed became one of the most extensive youth operations in the park's history. Yet in the middle of open terrain, with clear visibility and dozens of eyes nearby, not a single trace was ever found. Her case remains partially sealed more than 40 years later, with key pages withheld and questions left unanswered. This documentary examines the quiet mystery that still rests on that slope. The girl who walked into the trees, the afternoon air at Sunrise High Sierra Camp on the 17th of July 1981, moved slowly across the granite slopes, carrying the voices of hikers who had reached the small cluster of cabins after a long ascent. The wind pressed against the canvas roofs and drifted through the thin pines that circled the camp. Visitors described the place as quiet in a way that felt older than the park itself. Among the group that arrived that day was 14-year-old Stacy Arras from Saratoga, California. She had traveled with her father, George, on one of the guided mule trips that made their way through the upper elevations during midsummer. Photos taken earlier in the day showed her wearing light clothes and carrying only simple gear. Rangers would later write that she was in good spirits, rested, and uninjured when she stepped off her mule near the cabin. By late afternoon, most of the group settled into the camp's routine. Some walked toward the viewing ledge, where the land dropped into a valley. Others unpacked or tended to the animals. According to the official notes, Stacy asked if she could walk the short distance from the cabins to a rock outcrop where another member of the group, an older man, had been sitting to look at the landscape. The distance was less than 100 yards. Her father approved. Guides reported no concern. The terrain was open, the path to the outcrop was plain. Witnesses watched her take a few steps down the slope. That was the last time anyone saw her. The camp staff said the light remained steady. Nothing in the weather shifted. There was no sudden wind or drop in temperature that might confuse a young hiker. It was a calm, ordinary day. The older man she intended to meet later told search teams he saw her approaching for a moment, then bent down to adjust his pack. When he looked up again, she was gone. The space between his location and the cabins was small enough to cross in under a minute. Rangers noted in the early report that several people were nearby and no one heard a shout or fall. When Stacy did not return, her father alerted the guides. What followed became one of the largest youth search operations in Yosemite's history at that time. Rangers from Tuolumne Meadows were radioed. Mounted searchers moved out from the camp. Helicopters were deployed before sunset. Infrared scanners were flown the next morning. Dozens of volunteers arrived over the next 48 hours. According to a retired ranger interviewed in 1999, "We had the best eyes in the Sierra up there. Nothing, not one sign." The terrain around Sunrise Camp is mostly high granite, mixed with thin soil, patches of brush, and scattered timber. It is not complex, and visibility is high. A missing person leaving tracks would usually be found quickly. Yet, search reports mention no footprints attributed to Stacy, no clothing, no broken branches, and no drop items. Even the scent dogs, brought in early, failed to hold a consistent trail. A handler later said the dogs showed brief interest near the tree line east of the camp, but soon lost the signal. By the fourth day, the search grid extended to Echo Creek and toward the Cathedral Range. Teams walked shoulder to shoulder across open slopes. Helicopters flew low enough that dust lifted from the rocks. Rangers checked the water sources and the meadows where hikers sometimes stray. At a press briefing on July 21, officials stated there was no evidence to suggest direction of travel. That phrase has appeared in every retelling of the case since. Years later, people would ask why a teenager within sight of a busy camp on level ground could vanish in seconds. The explanations ranged from a sudden slip into a hidden crevice to a disoriented walk into thicker timber, but the reports mention no crevice deep enough to hide a person near the outcrop. They also note that she was not carrying extra gear, food, or a jacket. She left behind her sleeping bag and most belongings in the cabin. In 2011, a Freedom of Information Act request was filed by a researcher asking for the full investigative file. The National Park Service released some pages, including ranger statements and basic search records, but withheld large portions. The withheld sections were marked exempt ongoing investigative interest. When the requester appealed, the Park Service affirmed the decision. One ranger, whose name was redacted, wrote in an internal note, "Case remains sensitive due to circumstances at scene." This response deepened public interest. The case was 3 decades old, and no active search was underway. Families of other long-term missing persons had often received full files. Researchers who tracked Yosemite disappearances found that the Arras file was one of the few youth cases from the era that remained partially sealed. A former ranger, interviewed anonymously in 2017, said he believed the file contained early investigative leads that didn't go anywhere but raised questions. When asked what those questions were, he said only, "The timing didn't make sense. People were looking right where she should have been." He did not elaborate further. Visitors in the years after the disappearance sometimes reported seeing small memorials near the camp, a ribbon tied to a tree branch, a stone circle placed on a flat granite shelf, a name written faintly on weathered wood. Some said they heard from longtime staff that Stacy's father returned to the area more than once, walking the same short path between the cabin cluster and the rock outcrop. According to a retired mule packer named Paul Martinez, he walked it the same way she did, slow, like he wanted to feel the minutes. The search officially scaled down after 9 days, though rangers continued checking leads through the summer. One unconfirmed sighting came from a hiker who claimed to see a young girl with light hair near Long Meadow on July 19, but the description was vague and the location lay outside the probable range. Another ranger report noted that a camera Stacy had been carrying earlier in the trip was never recovered, though it is unclear whether she had it with her when she walked toward the outcrop. Forest Service personnel from neighboring districts later said they heard that the park had conducted secondary reviews of the case in the 1992 and early 2000s. These reviews were never made public. When independent researchers inquired, they were told the documents were internal use only. A short communication from 2008 mentioned that the file had been updated, but again, no details were shared. To this day, the full contents of the Arras case file remains sealed. The partial release shows a timeline, search maps, and witness notes. What remains hidden has never been described. Some believe the withheld documents contain nothing unusual, only sensitive personal information. Others think there may be details about the moment she vanished that the Park Service chose not to release. Without the remaining pages, no one outside the agency can know. The trail around Sunrise Camp still looks much as it did in 1981. The cabins sit in a soft arc, the outcrop faces the valley, the path between them remains short and unbroken. Rangers say hikers occasionally ask about the girl who vanished there. The answer is always brief. She walked out to take a picture, and then she was gone. Nothing more. The search that found nothing. When the first hours passed without any sign of Stacy Arras, the guides at Sunrise High Sierra Camp sent a radio call to Tuolumne Meadows Ranger Station. The time was noted as late afternoon, the 17th of July, 1981. The dispatcher logged the message in a short line. Missing juvenile, Sunrise Camp, last seen near rock outcrop. The wording was simple, but the response moved quickly. Rangers in the area understood the terrain, the weather, and the short distance between Stacy's last known position and the cabins. They expected a fast recovery. The early field notes show that no one believed the search would extend beyond sundown. The first team reached the camp before dark. They began what is known as a hasty search, moving along the obvious routes a lost hiker might take. They checked the rock outcrop, the tree line, and the shallow depressions formed by years of runoff. Each ranger called out her name and paused after each call to listen for any sound. The notes say, no response. A ranger, named Alan Brewer, wrote that he scanned the open granite for discarded items, clothing, or tracks. He found none. He circled the outcrop twice and reported nothing disturbed. As night came, temperatures dropped, but the air stayed stable. There was no storm, no strong wind, no weather event that might push a missing hiker away from the search zone. The clear conditions allowed the first helicopter to arrive early the next morning before sunrise. The flight log shows a simple line, infrared sweep, 0540 hours. The device used on the helicopter was early generation, not as advanced as modern scanners, but capable of picking up body heat in open areas. The operator noted no positive signatures across the granite slopes and meadows around the camp. By day 2, the search expanded into one of the largest youth operations Yosemite had conducted in that period. Rangers from neighboring regions arrived. Volunteers came from Lee Vining, Mariposa, and nearby communities. Members of the Alpine Search and Rescue Unit joined the effort. Some rode horses, others hiked. Helicopters flew repeated passes, creating steady noise that people at the camp remembered long after. A ranger who later reviewed the logs wrote, "Coverage was extensive, air and ground saturation above expected standards. The grid search patterns were laid across maps pinned to a makeshift board. Each segment was assigned to a team. The teams walked in parallel lines, spaced close enough that the area between them overlapped. Their goal was to leave no section unchecked. The logs list each completed grid with a short mark. None show positive findings." Ranger Brewer, who had worked multiple searches in the Sierra before this, wrote in a later comment that it was unusual to complete so many grids without a single clue. Dog teams arrived from Monterey and Santa Clara County. The handlers led them from the path between the cabins and the outcrop, expecting at least a short trail. The notes say the dogs indicated briefly near the east tree line, but lost scent quickly. The handlers described the behavior as inconsistent. A second dog, brought in on the morning of July 19, showed interest near a patch of brush, but then circled without direction and sat down. The handler recorded the result as negative. Helicopters covered Echo Creek Basin, Cathedral Range, Long Meadow, and the ridges stretching towards the Vogelsang area. The pilot notes describe the terrain as open, bright, minimal canopy. In such terrain, clothing or movement would usually stand out. The flight logs show pass after pass with no detection. Each entry ends with the same short phrase, "No find." On the ground, searchers followed natural lines of travel. They checked game trails, dry creek beds, and the narrow fractures in the rock. These fractures, called joints, can sometimes hide a person who fell or tried to take shelter. But the fractures around Sunrise Camp were shallow. Rangers documented each one they checked. None were deep enough to conceal a person. The searchers also looked into the few clusters of timber, but these areas were thin and offered limited hiding space. The logs consistently read, "Area clear." As the operation entered its fourth day, search managers began widening the radius. They extended the grid toward the southwest face above Red Lake and toward the north slopes near Columbia Finger. The extended areas were chosen to rule out the possibility that she had wandered farther than expected. The teams reported their progress in calm, simple language. One entry reads, "Walked ridge, visibility high, no disturbance noted." Another, "Checked meadow perimeter, no tracks." Newspaper reporters arrived at Tuolumne Meadows Ranger Station by July 20. The spokesperson told them, "We have no direction of travel." That phrase was repeated at every press briefing. Without a footprint, an item of clothing, or a confirmed sighting, search managers could not narrow the search. They kept the operation wide, hoping for a sign that never came. Some volunteers later recalled how strange it felt to search open terrain so thoroughly and still come back with nothing. On July 21, a report came from a hiker who said he saw a young girl with light hair near Long Meadow 2 days earlier. But the description lacked detail, and the timing did not match the known movements. Rangers investigated the location anyway. They followed the trail, checked the water sources, and examined the meadow. They found no sign. The report was marked unconfirmed. A second possible lead involved a camera Stacy had used earlier in the trip. Some believed she might have taken it with her when she walked towards the outcrop. If she had dropped it, it could serve as a clue. But the camera was never found. The search logs list it under missing items not recovered. Whether she had it in her hand at the moment she disappeared is still unknown. By day 7, the operation began to scale down. The maps, once filled with open grids, were now covered with completed marks. Each mark represented a section that had been checked more than once. Search teams began to repeat passes through the core area around the camp, hoping something had been missed. They found nothing. A ranger wrote, "Core zone rechecked. No evidence." The final helicopter pass took place on July 25. The pilot wrote that visibility remained good and winds were calm. He flew the same patterns used on the first day. Again, no sign. When the helicopter returned to base, the search was formally reduced to limited status. Rangers would continue to monitor leads, but the large-scale operation had ended. In later years, experts reviewing the case described the search as thorough beyond expected probability. The combination of clear weather, open terrain, and large manpower made the lack of evidence unusual. One retired ranger, interviewed in 2006, said, "We should have found something, even a footprint, even a thread, but nothing was ever found. Not then, not later, not at all." The redacted pages. When researchers first requested the Stacy Arras case file under the Freedom of Information Act, they expected a slim packet of routine records. The disappearance was decades old. The search had ended without findings, and the Park Service had no active investigation. Most missing person cases from the early 1982 had long been released in full. Instead, the response arrived with thick black bars covering entire paragraphs, names removed, and pages withheld entirely. The sections that remained visible raised more questions than they answered. The first FOIA request on record was filed in 2011 by a researcher named Thomas Klein. He requested the complete investigatory and search and rescue file concerning the disappearance of Stacy Arras on the 17th of July 1981. The Park Service's reply arrived weeks later. It included about 20 pages of basic records, early search logs, a timeline, a map with grid markings, and the brief statements taken from guides and rangers on the day she vanished. These were expected, but Klein quickly noticed something unusual. The pages that would normally contain follow-up notes, internal evaluations, or investigative summaries were marked Withheld Exemption 7A. That exemption is used when an investigative file is considered sensitive or still part of an ongoing inquiry. The response surprised him. Klein had reviewed older files from Yosemite before. Some involved complex cases with unidentified remains, others involved criminal suspects. Those files had been fully released. Yet the Arras case, an incident involving a girl who walked less than 1 minute from a camp, remained partially sealed. He sent an appeal. The reply was short. Decision affirmed. Other researchers took notice. In 2012, a journalist named Linda Hale filed her own request, seeking the withheld sections. The Park Service responded with the same blacked-out pages and a nearly identical exemption notice. Hale, who had covered missing person stories in the Sierra for years, wrote in her notes, "This is the only youth disappearance from this era that remains redacted. Something is being protected." The redacted pages appear in two main parts. The first section spans what should have been the detailed search manager notes, written on the second and third days. These notes typically record which routes were examined, any minor signs found, and discussions among the supervisors about tactics. In all other cases, these appear without restriction. But in the Arras file, most of these pages are either partially blanked or withheld. Only the headers remain. Day 2 review, lead sheet not for public distribution, and field assessment, the 19th of July 2081. No descriptions follow. The second redacted portion covers what seems to be the investigative summary, created after the large-scale search concluded. Nearly all of it is missing from the public file. Only small fragments remain, such as the line, "Initial circumstances require further evaluation," and another fragment reading, "Witness proximity complicates baseline assumption." The meaning is unclear. The fragments do not suggest criminal involvement, nor do they point to an accident. They only raise questions. In 2015, a former ranger named Daniel Mason, now retired and living in Nevada, confirmed to a researcher that he had once handled part of the Arras paperwork. He spoke briefly and asked not to be recorded. Mason said, "There were a few details that didn't match the usual pattern. I think that's why the file isn't fully open." When asked what details he meant, he declined to explain. He added only, "Someone was closer than they realized. That's all." His statement echoed a phrase found in one of the surviving pages from the initial ranger notes: "Multiple observers within line of sight." This line has been the subject of speculation because it implies Stacy vanished while several adults were watching the same area. Normally, that would eliminate the need to treat the case as anything more than an accidental disappearance. Yet the file treats the event as if more context existed. One of the earliest redacted pages is labeled "Interview Unidentified Witness." The page number is visible, but the entire text is blacked out, except for the time, 1537. This is 2 to 3 minutes after the last confirmed sighting. Some believe the witness may have seen movement, a figure, or an unexpected detail. Others think the witness might have offered information that contradicted the accepted timeline. Without the text, the purpose of the interview can only be guessed. Another page, partially visible, contains a line that has been copied and discussed many times. Scene integrity questioned by responding officer. The rest is redacted. What does scene integrity refer to at an open granite slope? In search and rescue terminology, the phrase is usually used when the initial area may have been altered, disturbed, or misinterpreted. Yet in this case, the terrain was simple, open, and stable. In 2017, a FOIA researcher named Henry Collins attempted a more targeted request. Instead of asking for the entire file, he requested 3 specific document categories: the full lead sheets, the complete list of witness interviews, and any secondary investigative reviews conducted after 1981. The Park Service denied 2 of the 3 categories outright. The third category, secondary reviews, was acknowledged but marked exempt internal deliberative material. Collins later wrote, "A review was done, and they do not want to disclose it." A separate document, inadvertently released in a different FOIA request concerning Yosemite operations, mentions an internal meeting held in 2008 inches, which older missing person cases were discussed. The Arras case is listed with a short note. File updated, supervisory review completed. No further detail is included. The fact that the case was revisited nearly 30 years later suggests the Park Service still had active interest in certain aspects of the disappearance. One surviving section of the file concerns the camera Stacy had reportedly used earlier in the trip. The page is almost entirely redacted, but one line remains visible: status of personal item unresolved. The wording is strange. If the camera was simply lost, the file would normally note item not recovered. Instead, the phrasing leaves the status uncertain. Rangers at the time were never sure whether she had taken the camera when she walked toward the outcrop. The surviving pages do not clarify it. Taken together, the redactions do not form a clear picture. Instead, they form a shape of missing context. The withheld pages seem to cluster around the first minutes after Stacy was last seen, the statements of one or more unidentified witnesses, and the supervisory discussions that followed. None of these categories would normally require secrecy decades later unless the investigators believed the circumstances of the disappearance were unusual in ways not publicly disclosed. Some have argued that the withheld portions contain sensitive personal information, but the redactions extend into tactical notes, geographic assessments, and internal analyses sections that do not typically contain personal data. Others think the Park Service may be protecting procedural details or search techniques, yet those techniques are common across many released files. No other youth disappearance from that era is handled this way. A researcher who reviewed several Yosemite files from the late 1972 and early 1980 once said, "The Arras file feels incomplete, not because it is missing pieces, but because someone removed the parts that explain the pieces that remain." Quote, "The surviving fragments only emphasize what is absent. The withheld pages remain out of public reach, and the reasons remain unstated. The witnesses who saw nothing." The accounts given by the people at Sunrise High Sierra Camp on the 17th of July 1981 form the backbone of the Stacy Arras disappearance. Each person described the same quiet afternoon, the same short walk, the same open terrain. Yet their statements do not converge into a single clear picture. Instead, they form a series of calm, disconnected observations that leave large gaps between them. These gaps are where the mystery has lived for more than 40 years. The camp that afternoon held a small group: guides, mule riders, hikers resting after long days on the trail, and a few visitors passing through. The staff knew the rhythm of the area. Most people arrived tired, took off their packs, drank water, and walked around the open granite to stretch their legs. The cabins were arranged in a loose curve, facing the deep valley to the west. The rock outcrop where Stacy planned to go sat only a short walk down a gentle slope. The space between the 2 points was open and clean, with only thin pines and patches of dry soil interrupting the stone. The first witness account came from one of the guides. His statement, taken that same evening, was brief. He wrote that he saw Stacy walking toward the man sitting on the rock around late afternoon. He watched her for several steps. She did not appear distressed. She did not carry extra gear. She glanced back once towards the cabins, then continued walking. He looked away to check on a mule, and when he looked again, she was gone. He estimated no more than 30 seconds passed between these two glances. Another guide added a similar account. She said she saw Stacy walk down the slope and then disappear behind a thin tree. She expected to see her emerge moments later. When she did not, the guide assumed Stacy had reached the man at the outcrop and sat down out of view. Her statement includes a line that appears in the unredacted portion: "The walk is short. I didn't think anything unusual." Later, when the man reported that Stacy never reached him, the guide expressed confusion. She said, "I thought she was already there." The older man Stacy intended to visit gave one of the most discussed statements. His account was calm, plain, and consistent. He said he had been sitting on the outcrop, looking out toward Longmeadow. He saw her leave the cabins and walk down the slope toward him. He remembered the way the sunlight reflected from her hair. He bent down to adjust the strap of his pack. When he looked up again, she was not visible. He assumed she had turned back toward the cabins. He did not think to call out. His last line in the statement reads, "She was almost here, then she was not." One of the cabin guests, a woman in her early 50s, said she saw Stacy and her father earlier in the afternoon. She remembered the girl being cheerful and talking about taking pictures. When asked if she saw Stacy walking toward the outcrop, she said she only noticed movement on the slope, but could not confirm who it was. Her statement ends with, "I thought she was with someone." A hiker who arrived at the camp shortly before the disappearance offered a different perspective. He said the area was unusually quiet, the air felt still. People were scattered across the granite, but no one was more than 100 yards from the next person. He recalled hearing muted voices, but no distress. He added a small detail. "I saw a few birds take off suddenly near the trees." He did not know if that was related. Rangers later commented that the statements all described a peaceful afternoon, with good visibility, clear light, and open terrain. In many missing person cases, witnesses report confusion, poor weather, or thick vegetation. None of those factors existed here. The people present could see long distances. The slope between the cabins and the outcrop was not obstructed. The path was direct. The disappearance occurred within the span of one short walk that everyone assumed was routine. The most puzzling feature of the statements is the timing. According to the logs, there were at least 4 adults who had a partial line of sight on the slope. Not all were watching at the same moment, but enough overlap existed that someone should have seen a direction of travel. Instead, each witness saw only the beginning of the walk, or a moment in between, or the last sight of her approaching the outcrop. No one saw what came after. The disappearance seems to occur in the small gaps between their glances. One ranger noted in his early summary that the witnesses provided clear views but incomplete sequences. He meant that every piece of the timeline was visible to someone, yet no one saw the final moment. This type of gap is known in search work as a visibility break. But visibility breaks usually happen in dense forests, steep gullies, or when weather changes suddenly. None of those applied here. One faintly visible line from a redacted witness interview reads, "I don't understand how she didn't walk past me." The identity of this witness is unknown. The context is unclear. But the line suggests the person believed Stacy should have crossed their field of view and did not. Witness statements also reveal something subtle about the atmosphere of the camp that day. Everyone assumed Stacy was safe because the area seemed safe. The walk was short. The land was open. People were nearby. This assumption created a false sense of security. When Stacy did not return, the initial response carried a tone of disbelief rather than alarm. Several witnesses said they expected to see her reappear any moment. Those moments turned into minutes, then hours. The man on the outcrop later said he replayed the moment she vanished many times, trying to recall whether he heard a sound. His statement includes the line, "If she had called out, I would have heard." The witnesses closer to the cabins said the same. No cry, no fall, no sliding rock, no footsteps running in any direction, only silence. One ranger interviewed years later said, "People were watching the area without realizing they were watching. If something unusual happened, someone should have seen it." This statement captures the confusion the investigators faced. The witnesses were close enough to prevent the disappearance, yet none of them saw what prevented it. Some individuals present at the camp were never identified in later public records. One name appears once in a partially visible roster, then nowhere else in the released pages. Another witness, who reportedly gave a brief statement to a ranger on scene, is referenced in a redacted section with the label "Interview Pending," but no interview appears in the released documents. It is unknown whether these accounts were ever recorded in full. What remains consistent across all the witness statements is the absence of a final visual. Stacy began a short walk toward a visible person. She crossed open ground in clear daylight. She disappeared within a space where natural concealment did not exist. Those who watched her saw the beginning of the walk. None saw its end. Each person saw a piece. No one saw the whole. The terrain that should have given answers. The land around Sunrise High Sierra Camp is not the kind of place where someone disappears easily. Rangers who worked in the area during the 1,980 seconds often describe the terrain as open country, a phrase that carries weight in search and rescue work. Open country means sight lines are long, sound travels cleanly, and footsteps leave clear marks on the ground. In most missing person incidents, terrain either explains what happened or at least narrows the possibilities. But here, the terrain only deepened the confusion. Sunrise Camp rests at roughly 9,400 feet, where the granite of the Cathedral Range flattens into soft curves before dropping toward the Echo Creek Basin. The cabins are built on a shelf of pale stone that glows almost white in early afternoon light. A few clusters of lodgepole pine grow along the edges, thin enough that one can see straight through them. The rock outcrop where Stacy intended to walk is slightly lower than the cabins, but fully visible from nearly every angle. Rangers who visited the site the day after her disappearance wrote detailed descriptions of the slope. Their notes still survive in the partially released file. One ranger wrote, "Terrain between cabins and outcrop is open granite with sparse soil patches, visibility near total." Another wrote, "No fissures or cavities of depth near the path. In cases where hikers fall into crevices, rescuers often find scuff marks, disturbed gravel, or snapped branches. Searchers found none. From the spot where Stacy was last seen, the ground shifts into a gentle roll. Small pockets of soil collect in shallow depressions, but these patches are soft and record footprints easily, even in dry conditions." Rangers walked these patches with care, searching for impressions. They photographed the soil, dusted for detail, and documented disturbances. According to the official logs, no identifiable footprints were linked to Stacy. Those of the searchers, mules, and other visitors were catalogued, but none matched a small, recent track heading away from the cabins. The tree line east of the slope, mentioned in several witness statements, offered the next obvious location to search. The trees there stand in thin clusters, with little undergrowth. A person walking into those trees would remain visible for a long distance. Rangers swept the entire tree line on the first evening, and then again the next morning. They walked grid patterns among the trunks, marking each section with a tally on their maps. One ranger wrote, "Understory minimal, no concealment." Another wrote, simply, "Clear." Boulders the size of washing machines dot the slope, but none form caves or pockets. Searchers checked every space wide enough to conceal even a backpack. They found only dry needles, wind-blown dust, and a few insects moving across the stone. Nothing larger, nothing that suggested the presence of a person. Beyond the outcrop, the land descends into a meadow that holds water earlier in the season, but by July, most of it dries into packed earth bordered by soft grass. Tracks here remain visible for days. Deer, marmots, and the occasional coyote leave clear prints. Rangers searching the area photographed numerous animal tracks, but no human ones that matched Stacy's footwear. A ranger familiar with the region noted that people who wander into the meadow almost always leave a path that searchers can follow. This time, nothing appeared. To the south lies a slope leading toward Long Meadow. This is the area where a hiker later claimed he saw a girl with light hair 2 days after the disappearance. Searchers walked the entire stretch multiple times, moving from tree cluster to tree cluster and scanning the open areas between them. The meadow grasses were undisturbed. The soil held no recent human impressions, except those of the search teams. The ranger logs reflect this, with repeated notations of no disturbance written in careful handwriting. The rocky shelves north of camp were also checked. They consist of broken granite slabs stepped over one another. Even in this terrain, searchers expected to find evidence if someone moved through it. Granite flakes easily. A misplaced step often sends shards rolling. Search teams walked and listened for loose movement. They found no fresh breaks, no rolled stone, only the natural cracking of untouched rock. Helicopters surveyed the terrain from above. Their infrared scanners swept the slopes around the camp, the tree lines, the meadows, and the shallow valleys. Because the land is open, the scanner should have easily detected a heat signature, whether from a living person or, after enough time passed, from a body absorbing sunlight. But each pass returned the same report: no positive readings. The few features that could have concealed someone: fallen logs, deep brush pockets, narrow cracks, were minimal in this area. Sunrise Camp sits in a transition zone between alpine meadows and granite highlands. It lacks the thick underbrush found at lower elevations. Rangers mentioned this often in their notes and interviews. One wrote, "This is not a hiding landscape." The phrase appears again in a separate document, copied almost word for word. The only area that produced even minor interest was the thin tree line east of the outcrop, where dog teams showed brief, inconsistent alerts. But the soil beneath those trees was soft enough to preserve impressions, and none were found. The dogs circled, lost the trail, and sat down. Their handlers marked the area, and grid teams searched it twice more, finding nothing. Searchers also examined the shallow runoff channels carved by snowmelt. These channels can form low, hidden troughs where a person might collapse. Several rangers walked these channels slowly, scanning for cloth fibers, footprints, or drag marks. The channels were dry, shallow, and empty. Even the water sources near Sunrise Camp were examined, small tarns and trickles fed by melting snow on the higher peaks. Water clarity in July is high. Anything submerged remains visible unless covered by sediment. Searchers used poles to probe the bottoms. The logs describe these checks simply, clear. The terrain should have helped. It should have offered something: a track, a scrap of fabric, a broken branch, a direction of travel, a place where a person might fall or shelter. Instead, it offered silence. Rangers later said that they could walk for hours and see their own shadows moving across the stone, but nothing else moving at all. A retired ranger once summarized the area in a single sentence during an interview: "It's the kind of land that gives up answers quickly." But in this case, it gave none. The land did not conceal. The land did not confuse. The land did not explain. It only stood there, unchanged, with nothing to show for the girl who walked across it and vanished between two glances. The timeline that doesn't fit. The timeline of the Stacy Arras disappearance is built from small, precise moments. Each moment appears simple when viewed alone, but when placed together they form a sequence that does not behave the way time usually does in missing person cases. Rangers working the file in 1981 expected the timeline to lock into place once they gathered statements. Instead, the minutes around Stacy's disappearance seemed to thin out, leaving only fragments. These fragments define the case, not by what they reveal, but by what they fail to connect. The earliest part of the timeline begins with the arrival of the mule group at Sunrise High Sierra Camp. It was mid-afternoon on the 17th of July 1981. Witnesses remember steady light, no wind, and a calm tone across the camp. People dismounted, stretched, removed gear, and stepped toward the cabins. Stacy, according to her father, appeared energized by the view and asked almost immediately about taking photographs. This places her in a normal, unhurried state. The timeline opens without tension. Shortly after arrival, the group dispersed into the rhythm of the camp. Some visitors walked toward the western overlook, others checked the mule corral. Witnesses placed Stacy near the cabins with her father at what they believed was around 4 p.m. No one recorded the exact minute. But in search work, approximations often narrow over time as more accounts align. In this case, they did not. Some witnesses believed she left closer to 3:45. Others said it was after 4:10. The logs reflect this uncertainty, with 3 time windows circled, none confirmed. When Stacy asked permission to walk to the nearby rock outcrop, her father agreed. He later said she wanted a picture and that the outcrop was visible from where he stood. His statement suggests the moment felt routine. He did not note any concerns. According to ranger notes, he watched her step off, then turned to tend to something in their cabin space. This creates the first visibility gap, a short period when he was not watching. The walk from the cabins to the outcrop is short. Rangers estimated it takes between 45 seconds and 90 seconds at a normal pace. Several guides said they had walked it in less than a minute. Stacy walked slowly at first, according to one witness, adjusting her footing on the granite. This suggests she should have taken closer to a minute to reach the outcrop. At nearly the same moment she left, the older man already sitting on the outcrop saw her approaching. His estimate places his sighting within seconds of her departure. He remembered her taking a few steps down the slope. He then looked away to adjust his pack. He did not expect anything unusual to happen in the seconds before he looked up again. His statement includes the line, "I looked down for a moment." That moment likely lasted less than 10 seconds. Between those seconds lies the point where the timeline fractures. When he lifted his head, Stacy was no longer visible. She should have been on the slope, in open granite, without obstacles or shadows strong enough to hide a person. Rangers later traced the exact portion of the ground he had in view. There were no dips, no recesses, no place a person could move into without being seen. The next timing detail comes from a guide who saw Stacy moments earlier stepping behind a thin tree. The guide expected her to reappear on the other side. When she did not, the guide assumed she had changed direction. The timeline shows that this assumption delayed concern by several minutes. From these overlapping accounts, rangers attempted to construct a precise sequence. Stacy leaves cabins. Witness A sees her walking. Witness B sees her behind a tree. Witness C sees her approaching the outcrop. Witness C looks away. Stacy is gone. This sequence appears clear until the rangers compared the estimated times. The disappearance appears to occur in fewer than 15 seconds. Even if all witnesses were off by entire minutes, the The distance is too short for her to have walked out of view without being seen by any of them. Rangers noted this in a short line on an early field report. Timing inconsistent with geography. This line is preserved in the unredacted portion. It became one of the most quoted details in discussions about the case. When Stacy did not return after several minutes, her father asked the guides if they had seen her. This indicates 5 to 10 minutes passed after she left. The guides then walked toward the outcrop area, calling out. Witnesses described this as casual at first, expecting her to answer immediately. This moment marks the beginning of the second visibility break. Stacy should have been within earshot. She was not. The timeline after this point moves quickly. The guides expanded their search slightly. They checked behind the trees, the outcrop, and the path back to the cabins. This took several minutes. They found nothing. Rangers were notified soon after. The missing person clock officially began. When constructing timelines for disappearances, search managers rely heavily on the last known point and the last confirmed sighting. In this case, both occur almost simultaneously. The last known point is the space between the cabins and the outcrop. The last confirmed sighting is the moment the older man saw her nearing him. In most searches, these points define the starting radius. Here, they cover an area so small it could be crossed in a handful of steps. A ranger supervisor, reviewing the file in the mid-1990 seconds, wrote a comment in the margin of a photocopied timeline, window too narrow to allow distance. That comment was preserved in the partially released document. Another complication arises with the moment the hiker arriving at camp thought he saw movement on the slope, but could not confirm who it was. His estimated time conflicts slightly with the others. He believed he saw movement later than the other witnesses recalled. This inconsistency forced searchers to widen the interpreted window, but it only added confusion. Search managers later tried constructing 3 separate timelines: earliest, departure model, latest, departure model, and a midpoint model. In all 3 models, Stacy disappears in a span too brief to allow significant travel. Each model produced what one ranger called an unresolved gap. The files contain a small note that appears without redaction. Witness proximity reduces timeline flexibility. It means the disappearance occurred so close to so many people that timing errors alone cannot explain it. Even if each witness was off by 2 minutes, she still had no time to walk beyond visibility. One of the smallest but most puzzling details appears near the end of the Ranger activity log for July 17. The entry reads, "Cabins, 1,620 hours, all parties accounted for, except missing juvenile." The next line reads, "Outcrop cleared 1,623 hours." The 3-minute gap between these entries indicates that searchers reached the outcrop area almost immediately after the alarm was raised. They found nothing, no footprints, no broken vegetation, no dropped items, no sign she had passed through. In most mountain disappearances, expanding the timeline gives clarity. Shadows grow longer, estimation errors stretch into workable explanations, and assumptions relax. But here, expanding the timeline only makes the event less explainable. A ranger reviewing the case decades later said, "Something happened in seconds, but nothing in the terrain matches something that happens in seconds." The timeline should have helped. Instead, it became the part that made the least sense. The searchers who had seen it all. The people who searched for Stacy Arras were not new to Yosemite. Many of them had spent years tracing the high country on foot, learning how sound moved between ridges, how footprints behaved on granite, and how to read faint marks in soil left by animals or hikers. They were trained to look for broken pine needles, overturned stones, or the slightest disturbance in dust. These were the kinds of clues they had followed hundreds of times before. Yet when they reached Sunrise, High Sierra Camp after Stacy disappeared, several of them later said the same quiet sentence, "Something felt wrong from the start." The first rangers to arrive at the scene were from Tuolumne Meadows, a team accustomed to fast response in the high elevations. One of them, identified in the file only as RB, wrote in his notes that he approached the slope expecting to find some indication of direction. His early entries contain carefully spaced words: open ground, good visibility, no sign. For a ranger who had tracked countless hikers over the years, this absence was unusual. He had once found a missing backpacker by following a single displaced pebble down a drainage. Here, even the smallest clues were missing. Another ranger, a woman named Susan Fletcher, had worked water rescues, winter searches, and lost child cases in lower elevations. She was flown in the next morning with several others. Her brief statement, One of the few personal reflections left unredacted includes a simple line: "Search felt off balance." She did not elaborate, but years later, when interviewed by a researcher, she said the terrain looked too untouched for someone to have walked across it only hours earlier. She said she kept expecting to see a smudge on the granite, a scuffed edge on a branch, or even a small slide of loosened soil. Nothing appeared. The dog handlers who joined the search were also experienced. Many had worked disaster sites, remote rescues, and criminal tracking cases. Their dogs were trained to follow scent trails across complicated ground. Yet in this case, the dogs provided only faint, inconsistent alerts. One handler wrote, "No strong pickup," brief interest, then neutral. Another wrote, "Dogs showed curiosity toward trees, but did not commit." Handlers are trained to interpret subtle signals, and in most searches, dogs give clear directional pulls when a human scent is fresh. Here, they did not. This puzzled the handlers enough that they discussed it among themselves that evening. One later told a colleague, "It was like the trail just wasn't there." Helicopter pilots conducting infrared sweeps were among the most seasoned in the region. They had flown recovery missions across cliffs, through narrow valleys, and over thick forests. Infrared equipment in 1981 was less advanced than today's, but skilled pilots often compensated by adjusting angles and flying repeat passes. The pilot on the Arras search logged several scans over the slope, the meadows, and the downstream areas. His log notes are abrupt. No heat signature detected. In later commentary, preserved in a training memo, he said the area was too clean, meaning the granite and open soil should have provided contrast if a body were present. Yet nothing registered. Search and rescue veterans who arrived on day 3 described a growing, steady confusion. Many had expected at least one small clue by then. In similar cases, even when a person had travelled far from the starting point, signs appeared sooner or later: broken branches, water access points, intersections where the missing person might have hesitated. Here, none of these traces appeared. A veteran SAR member named Tony Webb reportedly said, "We weren't finding nothing, we were finding less than nothing." The phrase stuck with those who heard it. Some searchers also remarked on the silence. The High Sierra often feels quiet, but during search operations the environment usually fills with movement, people calling out, branches shifting underfoot, distant echoes of teams on other parts of the grid. During the Arras search, several rangers later said the landscape felt unusually still, as if sound did not travel as far as expected. One ranger wrote a short observation in his notebook: "Calls do not carry." He crossed out the line, but the imprint remained visible in the scanned version. By day 4, the search expanded far beyond the immediate slope. Teams familiar with deep forest searches swept downward toward Echo Creek. These rangers were used to difficult terrain, thick timber, tangled brush, and blind gullies, where sound disappeared. Yet even in these lower areas, the absence of clues surprised them. A ranger who had worked a similar case near Ten Lakes Basin said, "That was hard terrain. This is easy terrain, but the easy terrain gave us nothing." Interviews conducted years later reveal another subtle pattern. Several rangers said privately that the early hours of the search didn't feel like a lost hiker case. They could not explain why. The weather was clear. The visibility was good. There was no sign of struggle, no indication of an animal interaction, and no evidence that Stacy had travelled beyond the immediate area. SAR veteran Bill Harmon reportedly said in a lecture, "In search work, you get a sense early on what you're dealing with. This one didn't match any category." One ranger, speaking anonymously decades later, said, "We weren't working outward from clues, we were working outward from emptiness." He described feeling unsettled as he walked the grid, an unusual reaction for someone with decades of experience. He said the more they searched, the less sense the landscape made. He noted the open slope felt too open, the tree line too light, the depressions too shallow, as if the land itself rejected the idea of a person vanishing there. Several flight crew members echoed this sentiment. One pilot said, "When you fly over a search area after a few days, you expect to see some disturbance, fresh tracks, footpaths forming from the team. But in that zone, even our own tracks seemed faint." This comment appeared in a 1991 training discussion whose notes survived in partial form. The search managers, reviewing logs each evening, grew frustrated by the lack of progress. They adjusted the grid shapes, expanded the radius, shifted teams from rock shelves to tree lines. Nothing changed. Even after thousands of combined hours, not a single object belonging to Stacy was found. No clothing, no shoe prints, no camera, no fiber, no direction of travel. As one supervisor wrote, negative in all sectors. By the time the search was scaled down, the people involved were left with a rare and unsettling experience, a search with no narrative. In their world, clues link to patterns, patterns link to movement, and movement leads to resolution. Here, the movement never existed on paper. The land stayed still, the evidence stayed absent, and the searchers were left with a case they had no framework for. A retired ranger summed it up years later: "We had the best eyes on that mountain, and the mountain gave them nothing. The camera that was never found." Among the small details in the Stacy Arras case, one object appears again and again in the surviving files, the ranger logs, and the few unredacted comments that remain: her camera. It was a simple, lightweight model common for teenagers in the early 1980 seconds, carried mostly to take pictures of scenery and family moments. Several people saw her using it earlier in the mule trip. She had taken photographs during the ride towards Sunrise High Sierra Camp, capturing wide views of the High Sierra granite. According to her father, she enjoyed using it and kept it close, but whether she carried it with her on the short walk to the rock outcrop has never been confirmed. This uncertainty created one of the most persistent loose threads in the case. The surviving parts of the file mention the camera in careful, measured phrases. One of them reads, "Status of personal item unresolved." Another appears as a single line near the bottom of a partially released inventory page. Camera last documented earlier in day, not recovered. In normal missing person files, personal items either appear in the belongings list or are recorded as left behind. The Arras file places the camera in a third category, one that leaves its location unknown and unverified. In his early statement, Stacy's father said he did not remember whether she had the camera in her hand when she walked away. He recalled seeing it earlier that afternoon, but he could not say if she had decided to bring it with her to the outcrop. This single uncertainty affected the early phases of the search. If she had carried the camera, searchers expected to find it even if she had fallen, even if she had become disoriented. Cameras from that era were not sleek or soft-edged. They were solid plastic or metal objects that often separated from a person during a fall. Many past recoveries had begun with finding a dropped camera or strap before finding the missing hiker. Rangers searched the immediate area with the expectation that if she had slipped, the camera would be nearby. They scanned the granite for reflective surfaces. They checked shallow depressions where a camera might settle. They searched under logs and under the thin brush near the tree line. The missing camera became one of the first clues they hoped to find, yet nothing appeared. A ranger named Fletcher later said that finding no device or strap felt strange for a person last seen walking calmly on open ground. She noted that even if the camera had landed behind a rock, helicopters conducting infrared sweeps often detect the heat signatures of objects that have absorbed sunlight. But aerial sweeps found nothing resembling a camera. Search logs from days 3 and 4 include short notations, "Camera not located." These appear repeatedly, suggesting the item remained a key point of interest. On one page, rangers wrote, "Search all pockets, depressions, and brush pockets for camera evidence." They covered areas where the soil was soft enough to capture even the smallest impressions. No impression of a dropped object was documented. Some rangers questioned whether the camera might have been in her cabin at the time she disappeared. A recheck of the cabin showed her sleeping bag and clothing, but did not confirm the camera's presence. One log entry reads, "Cabin inventory incomplete." Another states, "No camera located among known belongings." Rangers did not photograph the cabin contents immediately, a common practice at the time, so the presence or absence of the camera remains undocumented. Later reviewers of the case noted that the uncertainty around the camera added difficulty to reconstructing Stacy's intentions. If she brought the camera, it might indicate she intended only to take photographs and return quickly. If she did not, her reason for walking to the outcrop becomes less clear, though the distance remains small either way. The camera's unknown status limited the ability to interpret her mindset in the final moments she was seen. In the early 1990 seconds, when a secondary review of the case reportedly occurred, the missing camera came up again. One line from that internal document, partially visible through redaction, reads, "Camera discrepancy persists." This suggests the issue remained unresolved even a decade later. Some researchers have wondered whether the withheld sections of the file contain additional notes about the camera. Since cameras often capture final images that help establish direction of travel or last known scenery, investigators may have treated it as a significant missing piece. If the camera had been found anywhere in the search area, it would have narrowed the timeline and potentially the location of the disappearance. The fact that no such discovery is documented publicly has kept the camera at the center of speculation. One retired ranger, speaking off record in 2007, mentioned the camera without being asked. He said, "If we'd found the camera, we would know more." His tone, described by the interviewer as flat and certain, suggested he felt the missing item carried more weight than people outside the search community realized. When asked whether the absence of the camera suggested direction of travel, he said only, "It suggests the absence of a trail entirely." The camera also presented a practical puzzle. Objects rarely vanish in open high country terrain. Even after weeks, months, or years, hikers and rangers often find remnants scattered near known routes. A camera case, a strap, or its metal components would endure seasons of weather. The area around Sunrise Camp was walked repeatedly by hikers in later summers. None of them ever reported finding a camera or anything like it. The environment was too open to hide it indefinitely. Rangers familiar with gear recovery mentioned that the strap of the camera, if dropped, would typically catch on the granite or wedge in small cracks. Even if it rolled, it would leave marks or settle in a predictable place. But no such marks appear in the logs. A ranger in 1981 noted that he checked the runoff channels, where small objects sometimes collect. These channels yielded nothing. After the main search ended, the missing camera took on a symbolic role, in the case, a small object that stood for the absence of larger answers. Reviewers of the file often refer to it as the ghost item, something that should have been easy to find but wasn't. In a 2012 commentary, one researcher wrote, "The camera marks the boundary between what we know and what we cannot reconstruct. It is the missing object in a disappearance, defined by missing context." What remains today is a simple fact. The camera was not recovered, either during the search or in the decades that followed. Its absence is not proof of anything on its own, but in the context of a disappearance with no tracks, no sightings, and no debris, the missing camera becomes another quiet reminder that the case is shaped as much by what was never found as by what was. A ranger once summarized it in a memo with an uncharacteristic note of frustration. "Items leave traces. People leave traces. Here, none did. And the unanswered question remains, did she take the camera with her, or did something else happen before anyone thought to look?" The redirections and dead ends. In the days and weeks following the disappearance of Stacy Arras, searchers, rangers, and investigators followed every thread that surfaced. Each thread began with hope, or at least possibility, but ended in the same place, nowhere. These redirections, brief moments where something seemed to break the silence, form an important part of the case. They show how many avenues were explored and how each one dissolved under the simplest scrutiny. What remains now is a sequence of short-lived leads that offered shape but no substance. The first redirection emerged on the morning after the disappearance. A hiker passing through Sunrise Camp mentioned seeing movement near the outcrop sometime after the first search had begun. His description was vague and offered no identifiable features. Rangers walked him to the slope and asked him to point to the area he had seen. His gesture covered an arc of ground that the search teams had already scanned multiple times. They asked if he could describe the movement's height, direction, or speed. He could not. His note in the file ends with the line, "Possibly animal." The lead was marked unconfirmed. Another redirection appeared around midday on July 19, when a family hiking near Long Meadow reported seeing a young girl with blonde or light hair walking alone. They estimated the sighting occurred 2 days earlier, but could not recall the exact time. The report caught the attention of search managers because Long Meadow lies within a possible but distant radius. Rangers questioned the family in detail. The girl they saw was described as wearing clothing inconsistent with what Stacy had been wearing at camp. Their sighting occurred on the wrong side of the meadow's drainage, in an area that would require crossing steep, exposed ground. Search logs state, description insufficient, clothing mismatch, area negative, the lead collapsed. On July 20, a backpacker arriving from Cathedral Lakes mentioned that he had seen a small figure far below a ridgeline. He admitted the figure could have been a shadow or a deer. The distance was so great that the sighting lacked detail. Rangers checked the basin below the ridge anyway. They walked the granite bowls, the timber edges, and the shallow cracks where runoff collected. The basin search took hours. Rangers found no tracks, no items, and no sign of human movement. The report's final line reads, "Likely misperception." Later that same day, A pair of hikers reported hearing what they described as a faint, high sound near an adjacent drainage. They assumed it was an animal, but mentioned it to rangers after hearing about the missing girl. A sound sweep was conducted. Rangers walked the drainage, paused at intervals, and called out. The search dog was brought through the same area, but showed no interest. The sound, if it occurred at all, left no trace. The lead was noted and dismissed. One of the most persistent dead ends involved a small piece of fabric found near a boulder field east of camp. A volunteer discovered it during the third day of the search. For a moment, hope rose quietly among the team. The fabric was described as light-coloured and thin, possibly matching the colour of Stacy's clothing. Rangers bagged it and brought it to the search managers. Hours later, the lead collapsed. The fabric was from a tent repair kit carried by one of the hikers at the camp. It had fallen from his pack earlier in the week. Another moment of interest emerged when a ranger, brushing through a patch of low brush, found what looked like a faint impression in the soil. He believed it could have been a partial footprint. Searchers gathered, photographed the impression, and compared the shoe size to Stacy's. The soil had dried unevenly, causing a natural crack that resembled a tread pattern. When the edges were examined under magnification, the pattern proved inconsistent with any known shoe. The log entry reads, "Natural formation, no correlation." Search teams also investigated a cluster of rocks where one ranger thought he saw a disturbed patch of dust. The dust patch was small, only a few inches wide, and located near a spot where marmots often travelled. Tracks nearby confirmed animal activity. The disturbance matched their movement. The lead was marked animal-related. Multiple times, the searchers re-examined the runoff channels for evidence of movement. These channels sometimes trap small objects, a strap, a camera, a piece of cloth. A ranger once thought he saw a faint glint in one of the channels. He climbed into the trough and searched thoroughly. The glint came from a piece of mica embedded in the granite. Nothing else was found. Around day 6, a rumour circulated among volunteers that someone had found a shoe print far from the main search area. Rangers traced the rumour to a teenage volunteer who believed he had seen a footprint near Echo Creek. He had not photographed it. When rangers examined the location, they found only overlapping deer tracks. The volunteer later said he may have imagined it. Another dead end came from a report of a small figure lying down near a rock shelf south of camp. 2 hikers had looked from a distance and thought they saw something unusual. Rangers reached the location in under 30 minutes. The figure they saw from afar was a broken log bleached by the sun. The hikers apologized for the false alarm. Rangers logged the check, shelf clear. In one instance, a search helicopter reported a possible object near a shadowed area below a ridge. The object appeared pale and angular. A ground team climbed the ridge and descended to the exact coordinates. What they found was a patch of light-coloured lichen growing along a seam in the rock. The helicopter pilot later noted that the angle of the sun had made the lichen appear reflective. The lead was marked vegetation misidentified. By the 7th day, search managers had catalogued dozens of leads. Each one had seemed promising at its start. Each one ended quietly. The file contains no dramatic contradictions, no dangerous misdirections, no criminal indicators, just a series of small, ordinary misperceptions that usually accompany large searches. But here, the cumulative effect is different. In most searches, even false leads help shape the direction of inquiry. They help define patterns of movement or key terrain features. In the Arras case, the leads pointed nowhere. They formed no lines, no clusters, no tendencies. A ranger, reviewing the dead-end list years later, wrote in the margin of a photocopy, "All noise, no signal." His comment summarized the feeling many searchers carried. The leads provided motion, but not meaning. As days passed without progress, rangers returned again and again to the original site, the slope, the outcrop, the thin tree line. They hoped that a clue overlooked before might now reveal itself. But each return to the starting point delivered the same result: undisturbed ground, unchanged wind patterns, and no new leads. The landscape offered nothing back. One search manager, reflecting on the case decades later, said, "Dead ends are normal. This many dead ends in this open terrain are not." Each lead opened a door. Every door led to an empty room, and the case moved forward only by eliminating possibilities, never by finding answers. The internal notes that never made sense. Scattered through the surviving Arras file are a series of internal ranger notes, short, technical phrases written in the margins of reports or on standalone sheets. These notes were never intended for public view. Many were meant only for other supervisors or search managers working the case. Yet the fragments that survive, unredacted or partially visible beneath black ink, have become some of the most examined pieces of the entire file. They are brief, unemotional, and written in the same calm tone used for routine paperwork. But the content of these notes does not feel routine. Instead, they raise questions that the rest of the file cannot answer. One of the earliest surviving notes appears on a page dated July 18, the morning after the disappearance. It contains only 3 words: "Scene integrity questioned." The handwriting is neat, with no additional markings. Normally, this phrase appears when the starting point of a search has been disturbed, when too many people have moved through an area before investigators arrive, or when weather alters the scene. But at Sunrise Camp, the terrain was solid granite and dry soil. Several rangers later said the area had been barely touched before the first team arrived. Why the integrity was questioned is unclear. The rest of that page is fully redacted. Another note, found at the top of a lead sheet from the second day, reads, "Observer proximity complicates baseline." In search and rescue terminology, a baseline refers to the assumed path or behavior of the missing person. When multiple observers see the person in the moments before they vanish, the baseline should become clearer, not more complicated. Yet here, the note suggests the opposite. Investigators seem to believe the presence of several witnesses made the disappearance harder to understand. The meaning behind the phrase has never been explained. Another fragment appears in what was likely a supervisor's nightly assessment. The visible portion says, "Timeline compression apparent." This is not a phrase commonly found in search logs. It implies that the sequence of events happened in a shorter span of time than expected, shorter even than the witnesses described. In standard practice, investigators expand timelines to account for human error, but compression suggests the opposite. The gap between the last sighting and the moment of disappearance was even tighter than the witnesses believed. The phrase raises the question, how short was that final gap? A faint line appears on a photocopied map overlay used by search managers. Near the marked path between the cabins and the outcrop, an underlined notation reads, "Inconsistent visual gap. The slope between the 2 points is open. The witnesses had line of sight. The so-called gap should not exist." Yet the note suggests someone reviewing the scene believed the visibility window could not be reconciled with the disappearance. No explanation follows. Another internal note that has drawn attention is a margin comment found on the edge of a partially released report. "Initial conditions not replicable." The phrase is unusual. Search training often includes recreating a missing person's last movements in order to understand possibilities. Here, the note seems to indicate that walking the route did not recreate the visual circumstances described by witnesses. Some researchers interpret this to mean that the exact angle or position where Stacy vanished could not be reproduced by rangers standing in the same spots. The meaning remains uncertain. A separate sheet, likely an internal operations note, contains a single sentence fragment: "Visual continuity failure." The term is not used in search manuals. It appears to refer to the break in sightlines, described by multiple witnesses, the way Stacy was visible, then not, within a span of seconds. The wording suggests that investigators saw this break not as a simple lapse in attention, but as a structural problem within the witness accounts. Another line that has generated quiet discussion is from a document labelled "Supervisor Follow-up." The line, preserved without redaction, reads, "Multiple reports align but do not resolve." This is not unusual phrasing, but in the Arras case, it carries weight. Witnesses agreed on conditions, timing, and distance. Yet the accounts did not merge into a coherent explanation. Instead, their alignment only emphasized what was missing. One of the more cryptic internal notes is found on a page that was almost entirely redacted. Only 2 words remain: "Spatial mismatch." The context is lost, but the phrase implies that something about the physical relationship between witnesses, terrain, and distance did not add up. Some interpret this as referring to the idea that Stacy should have been visible from several angles at the moment she disappeared. The note does not specify what was mismatched. A line from a partially visible operations review mentions search area too responsive. This is an odd phrase. In SAR terms, a responsive terrain is one that reveals clues, easily soft soil, distinct tracks, clear breakage patterns. The granite and thin soil around Sunrise Camp are indeed responsive, yet the note reads as though describing a problem. The terrain was so responsive that the lack of clues became inexplicable. Another margin note, difficult to read but legible under enhanced scans produced by researchers, says, "Expected debris field absent. Even a short fall or slip often leaves behind some trace. A hair, a thread, a partial scuff." Here, the expected became absent. Searchers looked for hours. No debris appeared. Finally, on the last page of the partially released supervisor's log from the first week, a sentence survives almost completely intact. "Core anomaly persists. Adjust radius only after secondary verification." This suggests that investigators recognized an unresolved inconsistency at the center of the case, the area where Stacy walked, and did not want to expand the search radius until the original space was completely re-examined. The phrase core anomaly is rarely used. Its presence here has fueled speculation ever since. None of these internal notes offer explanations. They are not evidence of wrongdoing or of extraordinary circumstances. They do not suggest alternate theories. They instead reflect something far more subtle: confusion from people who were trained to find order in the wilderness. Every short line, every fragment, every cryptic note points to the same quiet problem. The disappearance did not behave the way a disappearance should. The terrain did not behave the way terrain should. The timeline did not behave the way time should. The notes show investigators trying to describe something they could not categorize. The file that will not open. The effort to access the full Stacy Arras case file began quietly, long before it reached public awareness. Early inquiries came from retired rangers, researchers, and families of other missing persons who were trying to understand why this particular file, unlike so many others from the same era, resisted release. Over time, the attempts to open the file formed a trail of their own, a paper trail marked by partial disclosures, repeated denials, and phrases that appeared nowhere else in similar cases. The earliest documented attempt to obtain the full file occurred in the mid-1990 seconds. A ranger who had moved into an administrative role submitted an internal request for historical case files concerning youth disappearances. His request is mentioned briefly in a 1998 internal inventory sheet where the Arras case is labelled "Restricted Supervisory Approval Required." This was unusual. Files older than 15 years were normally transferred to archival storage with fewer restrictions. Yet the Arras file remained flagged. The first formal Freedom of Information Act request came in 2011. As described in earlier chapters, the National Park Service released a small portion of the file while withholding the rest. What is most notable in the response is not the redactions themselves, but the exemption cited, 7A. This exemption applies to ongoing investigations. But by 2011, 3 decades had passed, and no active search or inquiry had been publicly acknowledged. Researchers questioned how the case could still qualify as ongoing. When the requester appealed, the Park Service affirmed its decision with a brief statement. Release would interfere with enforcement proceedings. The wording prompted more questions. What enforcement proceedings existed for a disappearance with no suspects, no crime, and no physical evidence? The appeal response offered no details. A second requester, a journalist investigating multiple Yosemite disappearances, filed a narrower request. She asked only for the withheld pages pertaining to the final investigative summary. The reply was the same, withheld in full. The exemption remained 7A, with an additional line referencing Exemption 5, internal deliberative processes. This combination of exemptions is uncommon in cases of long-term missing youth. It is typically used when agencies want to protect sensitive evaluations or discussions about internal procedures, not factual accounts of events at a campsite. Over the next decade, more requests followed. Some were broad, asking for the entire file. Others were precise, asking for specific interview transcripts, ranger reports, or the 2008 supervisory review referenced indirectly in another document. All met the same result: partial release, mostly redacted content, and withheld sections that remained sealed. One FOIA officer emailed a researcher in 2016 with a line that has since circulated widely. Certain components of the file remain of investigative interest. The officer did not elaborate on what those components were or why they still held interest. The phrase stands out because the disappearance had not been publicly linked to any ongoing case, criminal or otherwise. Another point of confusion comes from a line in a different FOIA denial one that was released inadvertently in a larger batch of Yosemite administrative responses. In that denial, the agency wrote, Portions of the file contain material not appropriate for public release due to context. The use of the word context prompted speculation. What context? Whose context? And how could context itself be classified? Researchers who reviewed dozens of missing person FOIA files from the 1,970 seconds and 1,980 seconds noticed something else. The Arras file was the only one in its category that remained partially sealed. Files involving disappearances in more dangerous or complex terrain, falls down cliffs, drownings, even criminal investigations were often released in full. Even cases involving minors had their investigative summaries made public after enough time had passed. The Arras file alone remained sealed. A retired FOIA officer, speaking anonymously in 2020, said he remembered the file because of a note attached to the front: "Consult before release." The officer said this was rare. He recalled only a handful of files in which additional review was required. When asked if the note included a reason, he said it did, but he could not recall the wording. He described it only as unusual. The most curious detail surfaced when an independent researcher requested a simple index of all documents contained in the Arras file without asking for their contents. The Park Service denied the request. Typically, even when content cannot be released, agencies provide an index listing document types: maps, interviews, reports, assessments. In this case, the index itself was withheld. The denial letter stated that releasing the index could reasonably be expected to interfere with enforcement proceedings. No explanation followed. Another attempt sought only the page count of the withheld sections. That request was also denied. According to the denial letter, page counts may reveal investigative scope. This reasoning is rarely invoked. Most FOIA responses freely include the number of withheld pages, even when content remains redacted. In 2019, a researcher filed another appeal asking why the file could be active when no new searches were taking place. The appeal was denied with a line that has since been quoted in multiple discussions: "This office cannot confirm or deny the existence of additional investigatory material." That phrase, "cannot confirm or deny," is typically used only in national security contexts, not missing person cases. The Park Service has never offered a detailed public explanation. There has been no press release, no re-evaluation statement, no formal acknowledgement that the case remains open or closed. The file's behaviour, its persistent partial sealing, is one of the few parts of the case with a tangible record. The refusals exist on paper, the exemptions exist on paper, the language exists on paper, but the reasons do not. A ranger who had reviewed the file many years earlier once said quietly to a colleague, "If the file made sense, it would be open." The colleague later repeated this line in an interview: "It is one of the simplest statements tied to the case, and one of the hardest to dismiss. The file does not open, the reasons do not appear, and the unanswered pages remain sealed behind black ink that has outlived every searcher who once stood on that granite slope." The silence that followed, when the large-scale search ended on the 25th of July 1981, Sunrise High Sierra Camp returned to its normal rhythm. Hikers arrived with dust on their boots, the mules clapped their hooves against the granite, and the wind carried the same thin sound across the open slope. But for those who had been part of the search, the camp no longer felt the same. The ground looked unchanged, yet people knew something had slipped from it quietly, without leaving a trace. The disappearance of Stacy Arras slowly moved from an urgent operation to a quiet entry in ranger logbooks. But the absence she left behind did not fade. In the months after the search ended, rangers would sometimes return to the area on their own. Some walked the slope again, trying to place themselves where the witnesses had stood. Others retraced the likely angles of visibility, stepping around the same thin trees where Stacy was last seen. A ranger named Brewer later said he walked that slope at least 15 times during off hours. He said it never yielded anything new, but he returned anyway because it felt like something should be there. The Park Service released no public updates that fall. The case was not declared resolved, nor was it officially closed. It entered a kind of administrative quiet, neither forgotten nor actively pursued. In missing person records, such situations are listed as unrecovered. The neutral tone of the word hides the weight beneath it. Nothing more could be done. Nothing more could be found. Visitors to Sunrise Camp in the years that followed often heard only fragments of the story from staff or fellow hikers. Guides would mention the girl who walked to take a picture and didn't come back. The tone was always gentle, never sensational. People reacted with brief surprise then wandered off to take their own photographs, unaware that the ground beneath their feet had once held a search effort that lasted 9 days and involved more than 100 people. Some rangers quietly acknowledged that the case stayed with them longer than others. In interviews decades later, several said they had sleepless nights thinking about the timeline, the silence, the absence of clues. One described the case as unfinished business without a path to finish it. Another said, "You learn to accept uncertainty in the mountains." But this one asked for more acceptance than I had. In the late 1980 seconds, new staff joined the Yosemite high country teams. Some heard the story on their first rotation up to sunrise. They treated it with respect, following the unwritten rule: speak about it softly, as if sound itself might disturb the space the case occupied. A young ranger who first heard of the disappearance in 1989 later said, "It wasn't a legend, it wasn't a ghost story, it was just a fact that sat in the room with us." Throughout the 1990 seconds, hikers occasionally reported finding ribbons or small cairns near the slope. Rangers removed them, not wanting the area to turn into an unofficial memorial or attract speculation. They preferred the slope to remain as it had been: simple granite, clean lines, and the sound of wind moving across thin trees. A ranger once wrote, "The land should speak for itself," but in this case, it never did. The case appeared briefly in a few regional newspapers during the early 2000s, usually in lists of unresolved Yosemite disappearances. Each mention was short: a girl vanished while walking to take a picture. A large search found nothing. The file remained partially sealed. No new information accompanied these articles. The public reaction was minimal. Inside the Park Service, however, the case never completely left the internal conversation. Supervisors referenced it occasionally during training sessions, not as a cautionary tale, but as an example of the limits of search and rescue work. One veteran SAR member said he used the case to remind new recruits that the land doesn't owe us clarity. Newer rangers hearing the story for the first time often reacted with disbelief that such an open area could produce no evidence. But the older rangers simply nodded. They had walked the slope, they had searched the trees, they had flown the air patterns. They knew what was missing. By the late 2000s, when researchers began filing FOIA requests, the silence around the case deepened rather than cracked. The unusual redactions, the withheld pages, and the vague exemption language brought the case back into public curiosity for a moment. But even then, the Park Service made no statements. The file remained sealed. Rangers still stationed near Sunrise Camp rarely spoke of the case except when asked directly, and even then, their answers were short. A ranger working the High Sierra route in 2015 recalled that whenever Stacy's name came up, older staff would pause for a moment before responding. He said, "They didn't avoid the topic. They just used fewer words than you expected." The case had become something understood mostly through silence. Silence in the terrain, silence in the file, silence in the explanations that never came. Visitors today who stand on the slope between the cabins and the outcrop would not know the history unless someone told them. The granite looks the same. The trees are only slightly taller. The wind still presses lightly against the ridge. The path Stacy walked is still visible, unchanged. If a person stands in the spot where she was last seen, they can trace the distance to the outcrop in a single slow breath. It is an easy walk. It always was. The story remains without resolution, without markers, without answers. Rangers who once searched the area are retired now, scattered across small towns in California and Nevada. Many have said, in interviews or in quiet conversations, that they still think of the case from time to time. Not with fear, not with speculation, but with a kind of steady disbelief that has not softened with age. One ranger, interviewed shortly before he passed away, summed up the feeling the case left behind. Some disappearances close with time. This one stayed open, even when everything else shut down. It's like the silence had more to say than the evidence ever did. There are no conclusions in the file. There are no answers in the terrain. There is only the quiet that settled over Sunrise Camp after July 1981 and never lifted. The story of Stacy Arras never closes. It sits inside a file that will not open, on a granite slope that still refuses to give anything back. Decades later, rangers, researchers, and families continue to ask the same quiet question: how does someone vanish in a place where vanishing should be impossible? If you want more deep, calm investigations into cases like this, where the silence tells the story, consider subscribing to the channel. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts, theories, or experiences in Yosemite's high country. And if this documentary gave you something to think about, a like helps bring it to others who follow these mysteries. Thank you for watching. Stay safe on the trails. And remember, some places hold their answers longer than others.